Good afternoon and good morning. Thank you for joining the informational webinar for the fiscal year 2021 Swift Certain Fair, or SCF, BJA grant. I'm Jonathan Kulik. I'm the co-director of the SCF Resource Center at NYU. Also on with me is co-director Sandy Mullins. And from BJA, we have Emily Chande, the senior policy advisor for SCF, and Anya Dobrozhanska, the state policy advisor for SCF. Just a couple of technical notes. If you'd like to ask a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat. And the other participants will not see your question until we reply, and will either reply in the window or answer your question live. And you should have seen a notice that we are recording this webinar, and we will make it available shortly. So why are we doing SCF? Well, there are problems in community supervision, pretrial, probation, and parole that are familiar to most of us. In the US, about 7 million adults are supervised by correctional agencies, about 4.5 million of whom are on community supervision. We know that community supervision agencies are subjected to high expectations. Officers or agents are expected to act as both law enforcement officers and social workers. And failure rates on supervision are high, despite there being many initiatives that are targeting the problem. There is incarceration for technical violation sanctions using jail or revocation to prison, and high rates of reoffending despite everyone's best efforts. So the particulars will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and agency to agency, but we know that they have some things in common. Typically, resources are strained. Officers have large caseloads. There are long conditions of supervised release, which can be difficult for everyone to understand and follow. There's generally a limited ability to supervise, including testing for drug and alcohol use when that's appropriate. And there's often limited treatment options and appropriate programming. Things are also often unclear. The supervision conditions may include things like obey all laws. And because there are so many conditions, compliance with all of them can be difficult to monitor, and violations often go undetected. So this sends a message to the person being supervised that the probability of being caught violating is low. Now, behavioral research tells us that all of us need to have a very high expectation of being caught to be deterred. So think of how most of us behave when we're driving. We may see posted speed limits or reminders of increased fines in work zones. But if we see a patrol car parked by the side of the road, that's going to have a much greater deterrence effect because we know that the likelihood of being caught is very high. Matters are also often inconsistent. Even when violations are detected, they're addressed inconsistently, varying from officer to officer or office to office. And enforcement might look different based on the resources, such as jail bed availability, or treatment options, or just having an officer available to follow through. And sometimes there's no sanction that's available between ignoring the behavior and revoking. That's why we need intermediate sanctions. What's the problem with inconsistency? Well, inconsistent response sends the message that the probability of a sanction is even lower, and that encourages risk-taking. And finally, we get often an unresponded to string of violations that sends a message that violating is okay. The criminal justice system is, in general, slow, not just community supervision, where when violations are detected and they're sanctioned, it's usually not quick. We often spend weeks waiting for the court to be in session or a parole board hearing. Similarly, warrants for absconding might not be served for weeks or months or even years. Again, behavioral research tells us that the closer in time that a response, whether it's a reward or a punishment, is to the behavior, the more the behavior is tied to the consequence. So someone being sanctioned for misbehaving months after the fact will see it as arbitrary and unfair. And similarly, a reward for a positive behavior, which is delivered quickly, is much more likely to encourage that behavior in the future. So this brings us to Swift Certain Fair, which is a model for community supervision, specifically for people who are at high risk of failure on supervision. It's based in principles of criminology and some of the findings in behavioral sciences that I mentioned. And principally, this says that to shape behavior, whether we're deterring negative behavior or encouraging positive behavior, We need to respond to those behaviors swiftly so that the responses are perceived as being tied to the behaviors, consistently so the responses are predictable and perceived as unbiased, and proportionately so that the responses are perceived as fair. So if responses to negative behaviors, that is sanctions, are slow and random, then even if they're severe, they won't deter. But if sanctions are swift and certain, then even modest sanctions can deter. We don't need to respond severely. If we manage to do all of this, then that yields what we think of as fairness or procedural justice. That's transparency, proportionality, and equal treatment. And when we're thinking about rewards, they can be something as simple as verbal praise or reduced reporting. They don't have to be something monetary or tangible. So putting all these principles together, we find that we can encourage the behavior that we want and discourage the behavior that we don't want. So in implementing SCF, every implementation will be different in the details, but they all share the behavioral response principles that underlie the model. Now, implementation, much of it has been challenging during COVID pandemic restraints. Many agencies have had to adjust their practices, as I'm sure you all have. So you want your rules and your expectations to be tailored to the individual and things that you care about. So don't impose rules with the implied or direct threat of the sanction if they are followed that you can't or won't force or won't have a consequence. And similarly, don't make promises you can't keep. You have to be credible, and having a simple set, clearly articulated rules really helps that. For an SCF implementation, it's good to have a formal orientation. Not simply handing the participant a piece of paper, but having the orientation delivered by somebody with some authority, whether it's a judge or a parole supervisor or whoever else might be appropriate. Keep the formal orientation in simple language so that everyone can understand, and provide an opportunity for the participant, or the supervised person, to ask questions and acknowledge that they understand what's expected of them and how you will respond. So in practice, again, the conditions need to be carefully monitored and actually enforced. And we know, again, that the pandemic has reduced physical contact, and that has required some adaptations. And when we say a swift response, again, that can vary, but generally mean hours or days rather than weeks or months, which is the usual practice in many places. Want to make sure to address every infraction, but the sanctions or the response can be modest. It certainly does not need to be jail or any other sort of confinement, which has been especially difficult or inappropriate during the pandemic. And the purpose of sanctions is to remind and to deter. It's not to incapacitate. We're talking about technical violations. Finally, a large body of research says that for many people, rewards are more effective than sanctions modifying behavior. So now I'm going to turn it over to colleague Sandy Mullins.
So just we often get asked, how does this work with a risk needs responsivity model? And HOPE, which was the original evaluated application of the SCF model, was implemented with a seasoned probation department in Honolulu that used risks and needs assessment and evidence-based practices such as motivational interviewing and other cognitive behavioral interventions. So some of you might know of this as the risk needs responsivity, or R&R model. HOPE was born out of probation's request to a judge that the courts support their efforts by encouraging and rewarding positive behavior and sanctioning misbehavior as it occurred, rather than their usual practice, which was letting the judge's usual practice, which was letting many smaller violations add up, and then ultimately they're addressed by ending probation and sending the probationer to prison. So HOPE was designed to support and enhance their R&R model rather than replace it. Almost all jurisdictions we interact with through the SCF Center work to some degree within an R&R model. Some limit their SCF program only to those who are moderate or high risk. So many base their supervision conditions on the assessed needs or the case plan built from their risk and needs assessment. But by using SCF sanctions and rewards, often in addition to motivational interviewing, they have a mechanism to increase compliance. Jurisdictions report that their clients start showing up to their office visits, programming, going to treatment, and when they show up, that they're eventually sober. So swift responses. So let's see. Next slide. Okay, so applying the SCF model. Jurisdictions are now applying the SCF model to many different criminal justice involved populations. So in Washington State, where I'm based out of, almost all parolees are supervised under a swift, certain, and fair model. In Arizona, 2 counties have applied the model to high-risk juveniles. In Honolulu, the birthplace of the HOPE program, they're now applying the model to a pretrial supervision population. In Pennsylvania and Nebraska, they have applied SCF in prisons. In DeKalb County, Illinois, the model is being tested with a select group of high and moderate risk probationers who have been unsuccessful on traditional probation. And they've recently expanded that to include domestic violence offenders as well. Macon, Bibb County, Georgia received a swift, certain, and fair grants to test the model on probationers charged with misdemeanor domestic violence offenses. So that is a project in process. And a wide range of jurisdictions have received these BJA awards. They've gone to states, counties, cities, tribes, and territories. They've been received by courts, probation departments, state correctional agencies, parole boards, and several law enforcement agencies. And you can see by the map, it's very expansive. SCF has been implemented in many states at a local or statewide level, in Indian Nation and Guam. The dark blue states have at least one jurisdiction or agency that received a BJA SCF award. The medium blue states have received other support for SCF from BJA. And the light blue states have implemented SCF without a BJA award. And these are the ones we know of. Oftentimes we'll find that somebody's implemented the model and we become aware of it after the fact. So among these SCF awardees, there's also a broad range in target population goals. We encourage you to be thoughtful in determining what's feasible for your jurisdiction. So more is not necessarily better. Even if you hope to eventually serve more people in your program or expand the model within your system, it can be helpful to start with a smaller target to work out the details. As you can see in this slide, BJA has awarded SCF grants to proposals with a broad number of target participants. So we've seen that this model can be generalized to a variety of populations, but that also means there is no one right way to apply SCF. So if you're working on your proposal, it's helpful to start by thinking about these questions. If you are the recipient of an SCF grant, you will be asked to answer these questions in more detail in your action plan, one of your required deliverables. The first question, which sounds easy enough but sometimes gets lost in project development, is what is the problem you're trying to solve? In Hawaii, drug crimes are aggressively prosecuted and probation sentences include long open prison terms that can be administered if someone fails on probation. The developers of HOPE were trying to reduce drug use, triage who needed treatment, and ultimately reduce prison time. In my home state of Washington, we were far less aggressive in sentencing and revoking on drug use, but we were spending over $15 million each year renting jail beds for parole violators who were waiting to receive a hearing for their violation. We were trying to find a quicker and cheaper way to address violations. In Macon, Bibb County, Georgia, they have a limited term of probation to work with for their misdemeanor DV clients, and they are trying to increase program participation and completion. So next would be, who is your target population? Logically, this should relate to your problem. If repeat violators are your problem, can you narrow this down? Some jurisdictions have targeted by type of offense or age. In New Jersey, the New Jersey Parole Board tested the model for parolees with opioid use disorder. Hidalgo County, Texas implemented the model with young adult probationers. The next question is, what is your jurisdiction, or who has the ability to give incentives and sanctions? In Washington State, the Department of Corrections has the authority, in most cases, to administratively sanction parole violators up to full revocation. In many states, a parole board has this authority. And if you're a probation department, the courts will likely have this authority. If the ultimate authority for sanctioning is with a court or parole board, what type of incentives or sanctions can be given by the supervising officer or agency? So you should be able to articulate business as usual and how your proposed SCF program differs from this as well. What are your resources and constraints? For instance, do you have a good mechanism to collect data, or do you need to include some IT or data collection support as part of your budget? Do you have jail or work release space for short-term confinement sanctions, or will you need to identify non-confinement options for sanctioning? Overall, keep in mind that your proposal is relative to where you begin. You can read about how other jurisdictions have implemented an SCF model, and it might help you develop your own thoughts around this, but your proposal should reflect the particular needs, authority, resources, and constraints of your jurisdiction. So I'm going to pass this on over to Emily now, BJA, now to get into the specifics of the application process.
Thank you, Sandy. Make sure I'm off mute. So I want to first call your attention to a change in the application process this year. As many of you likely know, the Office of Justice Programs has transitioned to a new grants management system called Just Grants. And under this new system, all applications will be submitted in a new two-step process that each have their own deadline. So the first step is to submit the application for federal assistance, also referred to as Standard Form 424 or SF 424, and the Lobbying Activity Disclosure Form, also referred to as SFLLL. Both of those need to be submitted in grants.gov by the stated deadline in the solicitation. The second step is to submit the full application, including all attachments in the Just Grant system. So this will be kind of what I refer to as the substantive portion of your submission, to include your project narrative, your budget, and all of the other required application components and attachments and supporting materials outlined in the solicitation. And the Just Grants deadline will normally be 2 weeks after the grants.gov deadline, but again, you'll see the specific deadlines in the solicitation. Next slide. So as I mentioned, Just Grants is our new grants management system. Some of the benefits of this new system are that it streamlines the grants life cycle from the application phase to the closeout of grants, and Anya's going to talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. So everything related to your grant will live in one place for the most part. And some of the application components are now web-based forms, which I've heard is quite helpful. So for example, there's now a web-based budget detail worksheet that creates kind of a standardized structure and narrative for all of DOJ. There's also a more streamlined validation process now that helps us clear budgets more quickly, which is great news. The system also gives applicants and award recipients more control over who has access to Just Grants and in what role. So some greater flexibility there. And as is the case every year, I would strongly encourage you to submit your application well before the stated deadlines for both grants.gov and Just Grants. Next slide. So this is just a helpful application submission checklist to ensure you're meeting all the steps before submitting an application. There's much greater detail in the solicitation itself about the application submission process and the required components, which I'm going to walk through in a moment. Just remember that at the end of every solicitation, there's a standard application checklist that you can use as kind of a cheat sheet to make sure that you're submitting all of the required elements in the solicitation. Next slide. Here, I just want to flag where you can find some, general information and trainings on the Just Grant system. So it's a really helpful link. I would encourage you to visit that site and explore those trainings and additional information on this system. Next slide. So before we describe some of the specifics related to grant requirements, I do want to just take a moment to give you a quick overview of the FY 2021 SCF solicitation. There's a link in the slide where you can access the full solicitation. I would encourage you to read the solicitation fully and carefully to make sure you understand all of the requirements. The grants.gov deadline is June 22nd, 2021. Again, this is where you'll be submitting your SF 424 and lobbying disclosure form. So that's step one. The Just Grants deadline is on July 6th, 2021. This is where you'll need to submit the full application. So that's the second and final step. This solicitation is open to units of state government, units of local government, and to federally recognized Indian tribes as determined by the Secretary of the Interior. Please note the definition of state in the solicitation includes the District of Columbia and the 5 U.S. territories. So those jurisdictions are all also eligible to apply. Applicants can apply for up to $700,000 in funding to implement the SCF principles, and the duration of the grant award will be for 48 months, which will begin on or about October 1st of 2021. Next slide. So you'll notice that there are several new OJP priority areas detailed in the solicitation this year that align with DOJ's larger priorities, and they are the promotion of civil rights, access to justice, support to crime victims, protecting the public from crime and evolving threats, building trust between law enforcement and the community, and applications that demonstrate that the people who are intended to benefit from the requested grant funds reside in high poverty areas or persistent poverty counties. So if your application aligns with one or more of these priority areas, you'll just need to provide a sufficient narrative explanation as an attachment describing how your proposed project will advance one or more of these goals. Next slide. So the application and submission information starts on page 8 of the solicitation. Applicants are strongly encouraged to carefully walk through all of the required elements. If an application is missing some elements, it could adversely affect the review, and if an award is made, there may be special conditions that could delay awardees' access to the use of grant funds until the missing elements have been provided. If an application is missing any of the elements identified as critical, which you can see there up on the screen, these include the proposal abstract, proposal narrative, budget detail worksheet, and budget narrative, as well as the letter of support from members of the applicant's SCF team. Those applications will not be factored into your review if they're missing any of those critical elements, so pay close attention to that. And when you're completing your budget worksheet and narrative, also pay close attention to the project timeline requirements in the solicitation that appear in the budget information section on page 7. The first 6 months of the grant are to support planning activities, including work on the required action plan that Sandy mentioned earlier. The following 30 months are for implementation activities, and then the final 12 months should support evaluation activities only, so things like data collection, review, and other evaluation-specific tasks. In terms of the action plan requirements, if awarded, grantees will have 6 months from when they receive the final budget clearance to develop an action plan that describes in detail how they will implement and evaluate the SCF principles. So this is kind of taking your grant proposal to the next level and really putting together a detailed blueprint for your project. During the action plan phase, BJA will withhold all but $200,000 of the grant award, and grantees will gain access to the remaining award amount after BJA has reviewed and approved the action plan. So keep in mind that, if awarded, this is not something you have to develop from whole cloth. We have a template that will guide you through the action planning process, and of course, Jonathan and Sandy will be working with you as well all through that process. And you can find more detail, again, in the budget information section of the solicitation. So as you're developing your project design and proposal narrative, I also want to note a few other things. So the solicitation requires a commitment to hire a full-time on-site program coordinator, and the intent of requiring an on-site program coordinator is to ensure that this person is accessible to project partners and members of the SCF team, that they're kind of fully immersed in the day-to-day decision-making, partner engagement, and coordination efforts that are required to successfully stand up an SCF project. So this includes a range of activities from developing policies and procedures to implement SCF, to fidelity monitoring and training for supervision staff and the like. So a question we've received in the past from applicants and grantees is, what exactly we mean by on-site and what level of flexibility there is in meeting this requirement. So, for example, it may be the case that there are 5 field offices implementing SCF responses under a particular grant program. It would be perfectly appropriate for the program coordinator in this scenario to be located in the central office to be well positioned to coordinate efforts across the 5 offices. So there is some flexibility with applying this requirement in order to meet the needs of a particular jurisdiction, and we're always willing to answer questions and troubleshoot to figure out kind of the best approach for your jurisdiction. So don't let that, kind of stop or stump you in any way. The solicitation also indicates that the program coordinator should be housed in the community supervision agency. So I just want to clarify that. While in most cases the community supervision agency will likely be the best home for the program coordinator, we recognize that the community supervision agency may not be the lead applicant driving the project forward. So again here, there's flexibility, and as stated in the solicitation, applicants have discretion in determining which agency would be most suitable to house the program coordinator based on the proposed project design and kind of the roles and responsibilities of the partner agencies and so forth. Next slide. So you'll find the additional application components to be included in the application starting on page 9 of the solicitation. This is where you'll find some additional instruction on how to provide documentation of any of the DOJ priority areas that I mentioned earlier that you may be seeking to address in your application. If you will be identifying a research partner in your grant application that you intend to work with, you'll need to submit a letter from the research partner demonstrating commitment to the project. If the community supervision agency is not the lead applicant on the project, you will need to include a letter of support from the community supervision agency documenting the role they will play on the project and demonstrating their commitment. Letters of support from all of your key SCF partners is a critical application element, meaning it must be included for your application to proceed through peer review. You can see some examples listed in the solicitation for common SCF partners as well. You'll need to provide position descriptions for all of the key roles for your project, as well as resumes for staff in those roles, unless, of course, you need to hire for some of those roles. You will also need to submit documentation of any proposed subrecipients, if applicable, for your proposed project. There's a template form that you are instructed to complete in Appendix A of the solicitation, which should be submitted as an attachment in JustGrants. And there's also a link in the solicitation to find more information about the distinction between a subrecipient or subaward and a contract. So generally speaking, a subrecipient is an entity that is helping to carry out the goals, objectives, and deliverables under the grant. A research partner, for example, would be a subrecipient because they are carrying out the stated goal of evaluating the efficacy of the SCF project. A contractor, on the other hand, is providing goods or services that are ancillary to the award. So, for example, an entity that provides UA testing services would be a contract. So I think I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to pass the baton back to Jonathan.
Thanks, Emily. So data and evaluation are really key to making an SCF implementation work. You need to collect detailed data on the people, that is the participants, how they are behaving, is what they're doing, and how the system is responding to those behaviors. So these data can serve multiple purposes. Sharing them with the TTA provider, which is the SCF Resource Center that Sandy and I direct, helps you, the grantee. As much as we enjoy talking with the grantees, the data can really tell a fuller story of what's going on and allows us to give you feedback on your implementation progress. It helps calculate statistics for the performance measurement tool, which you're required to submit quarterly, that documents the program progress. And as Emily mentioned, if you have a research or an evaluation partner, they will be wanting data as well to conduct the evaluation. And the SCF Resource Center coordinates well with your research or evaluation partners to make sure that the data that you are collecting serves both of our purposes and are not unduly burdening you. The SCF grant also requires midterm and final analysis report, which is independent of having a research partner. So when you're preparing your proposal, you should think about the demands that data collection may put on your IT, on the actual technology, and on the people, and including support for IT in your proposal budget if that's needed. So the program coordinator is an essential part of an SCF implementation. These awards have been given since 2014, and we've seen that having, as Emily said, a program coordinator who is well situated is really essential. So program coordinator needs to be devoted full-time to the SCF project, coordinates all of the stakeholders and agencies on policies and practices. Sometimes the grant will be given to an agency that, like a parole agency, that essentially conducts all of the functions of SCF, but oftentimes it's a collaboration among probation department and a court and service providers and local law enforcement, and the program coordinator really is essential for keeping everybody on the same page. Program coordinator is also the primary contact for the TTA provider and the research partner if you have one. The program coordinator monitors implementation. So for example, is the drug testing schedule working with tester availability? There are 1,000 details to attend to make sure that the program is being implemented with fidelity. And there are other questions with fidelity to the implementation plan, which, as Emily indicated, you will develop in your action plan. So on fidelity implementation, are the rewards that have been promised for good behavior, are they being issued? And as mentioned in the previous slide, the program coordinator was responsible for collecting data and seeing that it gets to everyone who needs it. Turn back to Sandy.
Yes, and I should note that the lady on the previous slide is a program coordinator out of DeKalb, Peggy, and some program coordinators don't really have as much contact with the clients as others, but many of the program coordinators also, some of them might manage, depending on the size of the program, might actually manage that caseload and interact, and that was Peggy during COVID, during the shutdown with the UA sample, so doing a little bit of everything, and she is the program coordinator there. So you can't do this alone. And this slide has some examples of partners you'll likely need to coordinate with. The application requires letters of support from key partners, and should you receive a grant, you'll need to engage your partners in the planning process. From previous grantees, we know that working with a broad array of partners is one of the more challenging aspects of implementing their SCF programs, but it's also one of the most beneficial. So these projects create a space in everyone's regular course of business for greater communication and collaboration. Often through this process, partners identify practice improvements that get applied beyond their SCF implementation. So just lots of collateral benefits from these projects. If funded, you will need a process to gather input from all partners throughout the planning and implementation project. And this allows you to do more rapid problem solving, and make adjustments as you determine if they are needed. And the coordinator will need to be able to negotiate diverse partner needs and expectations while keeping the focus on the principles of SCF, so getting everyone kind of grounded back into the SCF principles if it starts going astray. So next slide. And so as far as technical assistance, if you get the grant, Jonathan and I at the SCF Center will be your technical assistance provider. We'll walk you through your action plan development, and then through every step of the way, we'll be there with you. So help you strategize or doing your action planning, start up your fidelity monitoring, reporting. We really give as little or as much as needed. So some places, some jurisdictions that receive the grant, we talk to them almost on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. Others, we check in maybe quarterly because they don't feel as if that they need as much assistance. So it really depends on what works for you. We don't, as Jonathan said, we don't want to be an extra burden, but we'll help as much as possible. We also give workshops and do site visits back when we're able to travel again, or at least do Zoom site visits at this point. And that's really just to sort of train any of the people that'll be working on your program, reinforcing some of what the SCF history, what the model looks like, and helping answer questions and help with that process. And we can do that at any time, earlier or later in your project. I'm going to turn back over to Jonathan. I think or Anya, you tell me, Jonathan.
Sure. If there are any questions, you can post them to the Q&A and we will address them at the end. But now we will turn it over to Anya for more on the mechanics of the grant administration.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anya Dobzhańska, and I am a state policy advisor here at BJA. For SCF grant, I will be your main point of contact for all grant-related questions. Before we move on to the slides on post-award grant management, I just wanted to give you this additional slide with additional resources and helpful information and emails that will help you with your application process. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so I'm so happy to have everybody here today. In this presentation, I will do my best to give you a basic overview of what it is that you need for successful grant management. And if you are new to BJA grants, at least you will know what it is that we expect from you. I will also provide you on slide 42 with helpful resources such as DOJ Financial Guide. We strongly encourage you to take advantage of all the resources. However, if you have any questions at any point in time with your grant management, please do not hesitate to contact me. Remember, I am here to make sure that you have all the resources you need to reach the goals of your grant program. Next slide. When you log into Just Grants and look at your award package, you'll see a list of award conditions. Please carefully review every single award condition. There are additional requirements covering areas such as programmatic and financial reporting, prohibited uses of federal funds, consultant rates, changes in key personnel, and proper disposition of program income. We want you to become familiar with each condition so you know what it is expected from you. Next slide. Some award conditions will be withholding. These conditions place holds on funds for overdue reports or pending budget approval, other program requirements including documentation that was missing or incomplete during grant application review. As Emily mentioned earlier, you will have a list of documentation that you need to submit. I would like to just remind everyone to please properly label each document instead of submitting them all in one, so we can identify them swiftly and properly mark them off as submitted. If you look at Just Grants and see that you have any active withholding condition for a missing documentation, please email me the document. Sometimes we will attach this withholding condition if a document is submitted has incorrect information or missing information. So if you see any withholding special condition for a document, please make sure you email it to me so I can remove the withholding condition. And Emily already mentioned the action plan. You will have a withholding condition for an action plan until the action plan is finalized and approved. And then I will retire the withholding special condition to release the remainder of the funds once we have the approved plan. What's really important here for you to remember is that you really need to work with your state policy advisor, who for now is me, to remove any withholding special conditions before your agency can obligate any funds. You should not and cannot obligate any funding if you have any withholding award condition. Next slide. So as Jonathan mentioned earlier, you will be required to submit quarterly reports in Performance Metric Tool. I recommend printing these slides and making sure they are available to anyone so everybody who is responsible for reporting or new staff coming in and not being familiar with the grants reporting requirements is familiar with this. Of course, please make sure to have a really good data collection and reporting system in place. Once you submit a report in PMT and you need to make changes, please email me and I will forward the request to BJA PMT Help Desk. For any questions with PMT reports, please contact PMT Help Desk directly. Next slide. Progress reports in Just Grants will be required on semi-annual basis. You'll need to submit reports in Just Grants by January 30 and July 30. When those reports are due, you will simply go to PMT, download one PMT file, a PDF file for that reporting period, and upload it in Just Grants. Please remember that Just Grants automatically suspends access to your accounting system for delinquent reports. Once you submit an overdue report, the funds are automatically released. However, every time you submit a delinquent report, you create an audit trail, and that will impact your risk assessment by OJP. So we often see reports that are submitted without an attachment or incorrect attachment. So when you submit a report, please make sure that it's correct. Federal financial reports will also be required in Just Grants on quarterly basis. Here, please make sure that you have all the supporting documentation necessary. So when you report, the amount that was expended is actually matching your internal tracking records. If you did not have any activity for a reporting period, because you might have not started any activity or accepted the award when the report was due, please just enter 0. So all the financial reports are reviewed by OCFO. So if you have any questions with financial reports, please contact OCFO customer service. Next slide. You'll also see a condition regarding grants financial management training, which we offer online. Currently, in-person training is not available because of COVID-19, but we do encourage you to take online training at your own time. Completion of this required training for award main points of contact and financial contacts must be finished within 120 days of award acceptance. Failure to comply will result in a withholding award condition. This means that if you have new staff assigned as a main point of contact or financial contact, they also must take the training. If not, once we do a review internally and new staff has not completed the training, we will freeze your funds. That being said, if you completed the financial training, please email me the certificate of completion so we can retire your withholding condition for the financial training. And it's important to note here that recertification is required to remain in compliance. The training must be successfully completed every 3 years. Next slide. So Emily shortly mentioned the difference between subawards and procurement contracts. The proper determination of whether a pass-through entity is a subaward or a procurement contract is critical, as significantly different requirements apply based on the determination. The substance of the relationship should be given greater consideration than the form of the agreement between the prime recipient and the outside entity. If you delegate program activities to another entity, individual consultant or organization, that delegation will generally be considered a subaward. Most pass-through entities on your awards are programmatic and substantive and therefore should be classified as subawards. So as Emily mentioned earlier, if you have a research partner, that would be a subaward. Next slide. Here we have 3 links to wonderful resources to help you differentiate if it is a contract for procurement or a subaward. I encourage you to take a look at all 3 checklists for proper identification if it is a subaward or contract for procurement. If, when you submit your budget with your application and you determine after the fact that it is in fact a subaward or a contract for procurement, we can address the changes later on after the award is made. Next slide. And so if you have a subaward that is $25,000 or more, you are required to submit a FATA report. In the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act requires information on federal awards be made available to the public. FSRS is the FATA subaward reporting system used to capture and report subaward and executive compensation data regarding the first tier subawards to meet the FATA reporting requirements. So once you make a subaward of $25,000 or more, you'll need to be required to go into the FSRS and submit a FATA report at the end of the month following when the subaward was made. This report will only be submitted once. And also we will be checking when we're doing desk reviews or monitoring, we will be checking to make sure that you are in compliance with all FATA reporting requirements. Next slide. Through the life of the grant, you will need to make changes to more effectively meet goals of the program, and we understand that. For that, we will use grant award modification. If you go to a DOJ financial guide, you will see a lot of detailed information on different grant adjustment modifications and what is needed to submit a GAM and if it's actually needed. Some changes will be minor and may be approved through an email. So if you look at the financial guide and you're still not sure if a GAM is required, please feel free to email me and let me know what the changes are. I will either approve them through an email or I'll tell you to submit a GAM. GAMs, they are submitted in just grants and they include budget modifications. For this one, I just wanted to remind you that you must include a complete revised budget. So you will use the budget that you submitted with the application, revise it, and upload it in a GAM as a GAM budget modification. Reviewing this budget is like looking at a budget from scratch. So make sure that you have all the details. And again, not all budget modifications require a GAM. You are able to shift funds between approved budget categories up to 10% of the total award amount, as long as you're not creating a new budget category. But if you go to a DOJ financial guide, it will have detailed information on whether or not a GAM is required for budget modification and when. Also for changes to the scope, any programmatic activities, project period extensions, and sole source justifications. That applies to any non-competitive procurement contract of $250,000 or more. Once OJP makes a decision regarding the proposed change, the grantee is notified by Just Grants through an email. We ask everybody to allow up to 14 business days for all GAMs to be approved. And as a reminder, GAMs will not be approved if the grantee is delinquent with any reports. So once again, please make sure that you're always current with all your reporting requirements. Next slide. Project period extensions. These requests must be requested through Just Grants at least 30 days prior to the current end date. We don't encourage grantees to submit this request in Just Grants anytime sooner than 6 months prior to the project end date. Generally, no more than one no-cost extension may be made to an award. We currently have more flexibility because of COVID-19. A no-cost extension may not exceed 12 months past the original end date, be made only in a period of performance has not expired, and be made only for award recipients that have no significant performance or compliance issues. And I recommend that you contact your state policy advisor anytime you want to submit a request for a no-cost extension, so the state policy advisor will be able to provide you with the detailed information on what is needed in order for you to submit the request. Next slide. So BJA will conduct formal monitoring activities and hence desk reviews and site visits. Although currently because of COVID-19, we are not conducting any site visits, only just enhanced desk reviews, which is remote monitoring of grant recipients to ensure that the grantee is conducting activities that were proposed and approved, meeting programmatic, administrative, and fiscal requirements, identifying and resolving problems and/or issues, and receiving needed training and guidance. So if your award was selected for monitoring, don't be surprised when you see an email from us informing you that you will either be monitored remotely or through a site visit. Next slide. The common issues for resolution from our findings when we'll go out and monitoring are as follows. Unauthorized obligation of funds in violation of grant withholding special conditions and/or prior to budget clearance. This goes back to what I've mentioned before. Please make sure that all your withholding special conditions are cleared before you obligate funds. Incorrect classification of subaward as a procurement contract. And again, if you believe that you misclassified a subaward as a procurement contract after you submitted the application with your budget, we can always make that modification later by doing a budget modification GAM. use of funds for consultant rates in excess of $650 per day or $81.25 per hour without explicit prior approval from BJA through a GAM. So if you want to compensate a consultant more than $650 per day for an 8-hour day, then you need prior approval from us. For more information, please contact me regarding the ability to access that approval. Accounting policies and procedures are not documented or in need of improvement, and lack of tracking award expenditures by approved budget category. Indirect cost rate charged improperly or the rate has expired. Lack of budget modification GAM submission to reflect current rate agreement, which means if you have a different indirect cost agreement from what was approved in the budget, you will need to submit a GAM. Next slide. Lack of subrecipient monitoring policies and procedures that meet the requirements of 2 CFR 200. As a prime recipient, we expect you to have an oversight in place of all your subrecipients. And again, DOJ Financial Guide has enormous amounts of information regarding monitoring of subrecipients. Non-submission of GAMs for pre-approval of award changes, including scope, subrecipients, budget, target population, and assessment tools. Lack of compliance with FADA reporting requirements. Lack of documentation to support match activities and expenditures. And lack of documentation to support performance measurement data. Next slide. So this is the final slide of my presentation. Here you have all these resources that we hope that you take advantage of. DOJ Financial Guide should be your Bible. You should be familiar with it. It is your go-to resource for all questions regarding grant management. If you have a question, it's probably there. If it's not, please feel free to ask me. There is no such thing as a bad question. Just Grants links, FAQ, support, and training resources. As Emily mentioned, Just Grants is a new system for all of us. Please take a look at the training resources. They have wonderful links to videos showing you how to do everything from submission of reports to submission of GAMs. And final, the automated standard application for payments ASAP, which is our new system for you to access and manage funds. Next slide. So this concludes my portion of the presentation. And again, this is my information. Feel free to always contact me with any grant management related questions. And again, no question is a bad question. Thank you so much for having me here.
And thank you, Anya, and thank you, Emily and Sandy. And that is the end of today's webinar. We look forward to seeing your applications and hope to be working with you in the near future as an SCF grantee. Thank you very much.